I am now joined by David Harland, New Zealand diplomat and conflict resolution expert. He has been heading the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue since 2011, and they have participated in numerous negotiations from the South China Sea to the Sahel and Central America. David, thank you for joining me on this day.
Good to be here, Luke. Yeah, really good.
So I wanted to just get the ball rolling on how you started with the sector of diplomacy. I understand your father was a diplomat with the New Zealand government. And just wanted to get to know what was the first forming, let's say, event for yourself that really got you involved in international affairs.
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm sorry you start like that because it makes me feel really old. But yeah, I remember really strongly. I mean, in New Zealand, my dad covered Southeast Asia, Vietnam War for the New Zealand government. And every day would begin with him tuning the dials on the big radio that looked like an old-fashioned TV set on sort of four legs there, you know, wee-oo, and tuning into the different radio broadcasts on what had happened in the war in Vietnam, and you know, which was usually bad news from the you know, the position of those who supported the South in the war, as New Zealand did, and yeah, and actually my first, I guess the first thing that propelled me in this direction was at high school, after Saigon fell, so in '75, there was one of these speaking competitions, and I decided to do one on a speech on, you know, how New Zealand should be taking more Vietnamese refugees, the boat people. So I guess I've sort of been doing it all my life, Luke, or at least since the 70s.
I see. And the Vietnam War in itself, was New Zealand very active in it?
Well, we were a member of the, you know, U.S.-led alliance, and we made a token contribution. It wasn't, you know, I don't think it made a big military difference. I think we were in the center with the Australians near Da Nang. But it was politically traumatic for New Zealand, the way it was, you know, for a greater extent for you know, the United States and others who supported the South during the war. And of course, the idea or the narrative that was dominant in the United States and the world supporting the South was the domino theory. You know, the idea that if, you know, South Vietnam fell, then Cambodia and Thailand and Malaysia would all be next, and then there would be this huge, you know, cascade towards global communism. And yeah, actually the theory turned out to be wrong, but it was sort of my introduction to IR. And yeah, and then I ended up making a life of IR.
And as I understand it, you very much studied in Asia, and was that a particular focus for you in your career, or did you eventually expand into other horizons?
No. So my dad was made New Zealand's first ambassador to China in 1974, and so I lived in China, went to a Chinese school, and like became like a little red guard, and it was that was the Cultural Revolution in China. It was a time of like massive upheaval in China, and where everything was turned upside down. And in fact, our school was near a temple, and the school and the kids in the school were, you know, encouraged to like demolish part of the temple and replace it with like tomato patches and things. And so, and we, you know, we had we were given like little spears with tassels that would, and our school had a wall, and we were told how we would defend it if the Russians invaded the Soviets, because Chinese-Soviet relations were really bad, and then there were exercises on how to poison a secret well and stuff. So for like a 12-year-old kid from suburban New Zealand, it was a bit of a shock. It's like a totally different world. But it opened my eyes in a way to just how differently people can live their lives and how conflict works, and I learned Chinese. So it like a lot of life stories, it's pretty random, but it's definitely the one that sort of set me off on the path I'm still on almost half a century later.
And what do you make of the current Sino-led order that's being created in front of us, especially last week with the military parade?
Yeah, I mean, I think China's meteoric rise is it is the big phenomenon of our generation, and I think when I was a kid there, and even when I then went back to China as a grad student in 1982, when China was sort of just beginning this sort of period of explosive growth, I don't think anybody had any idea that it would become such an enormous, first economic power and then military power, and for sure, yeah, it's going to be a huge test of how the world runs itself, to see whether a catastrophic conflict between China and the United States can be avoided now that both are really, really super powerful. It's popular in, I guess, mainly U.S. IR circles to talk about the Thucydides trap. That when one great power is in relative decline, like the U.S., and another is rising rapidly, like China, that usually there's a conflict between them as the distribution of power shifts, and it's a huge risk, and it's the shadow over probably over your generation more than my generation, but yeah, I mean, in a way, it's been an incredible privilege of a life to watch China's rise.
As I understand it, just based on videos I've seen, there was recently this Chinese IR expert. I saw Dan Wong, I believe. He talked about how it's more of a war of attrition that we'll see. It's the first one to collapse before we could see a major military conflict, if anything. And the Chinese government is essentially for the West to essentially collapse. How do you assess that system?
I mean, I think it's really hard to know, because I think AI in particular is changing so much so fast that if you took AI out of the equation, I think there would actually be reason to think that the United States and China will be able to manage it. I mean, the way the United States and the Soviet Union did manage to live together in a world of nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction. And I think because obviously neither the United States nor China wants to blow up the world. So I think at one level you're almost certainly right that each side is sort of hoping that the other side will collapse, which is in the end what happened to the Soviet Union. Happened more internally than because of any war or external pressures. But if you took away the AI factor, I think you might guess that they would figure out how to manage it, because in fact Chinese growth, economic growth, is slowing, and so the the relative divergence, the likelihood that China will massively overtake the United States as an economic and military power is sort of fading a bit. But I think with AI, it's so disruptive and could so massively impact everything from how the trade system works to how nuclear weapons are launched, that I'm not going to place any bets.
And I'm curious to hear your opinion about the digitalization of propaganda, and I'm wondering if here at Center of Humanitarian Dialogue, you guys ever look deeper into how algorithms are used as a way to manipulate populations. Both foreign and domestic governments use them. And how powerful of a tool do you think it is?
No, I think it's another game changer. And I think the fact that now it's possible to generate vast numbers of deepfake bots sort of deployed into the social media space and so on is potentially a game changer. So in fact, as a mediator, one of the things that is changing is the line between war and not war is shifting a little, or is becoming more blurred. That until recently, basically, war means something kinetic. I mean, somebody shooting something at somebody else. Whereas I think there are now harms that can be done in the digital space, social media, cyber warfare, applications of AI, that can do like enormous harms and be enormously, for example, influential on public opinion without any kinetic activity. So actually one of the challenges in my profession as a mediator is to figure out whether the logic that applies in mediation of real war, old-fashioned kinetic war, also applies in these domains that used to be called short of war hostile actions.
And and with that, as you mentioned, there's all these different channels of war, essentially hybrid warfare. Do you think that's going to make the negotiations more complicated, or are you going to be able to manage each one as they come?
No, I think the way technology has evolved has made the mediation business, actually all diplomatic relations, more complicated, because there's always been a difference between perception and reality, but diplomats and people who do negotiations of various sort have always tried to have a certain space in which they can talk frankly about with the other party about what is possible and what is not possible. And I think given the pressures in the public space, public diplomacy and the political pressures to be visible in the public space, it's harder and harder to have those quiet, frank, realistic discussions. And we were talking about China, Luke, and in 1971 and 72 and 73, there were these epic visits to China made by Kissinger and then later by Nixon to see whether or not China and the US could patch things up, because both of them had bad relations with the Soviet Union. And Kissinger's first visit was completely secret, and then he was on the ground for quite a long time, days and days, talking to the Chinese leadership. And that whole type of diplomacy, which can be massively effective and has been the backbone of diplomacy for hundreds of years, that's basically impossible now. Every time a world leader is sort of out of the public eye for more than a few days, everybody goes crazy on it.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to touch back a little bit on negotiation styles. How do you think that non-state actors differ from state actors when it comes to negotiating? Is there a particular difference in their approach?
I mean, in general, strong parties, whether it's a country or a non-state actor, or whether it's, other forms of negotiation and mediation, businesses, families, whatever. In general, there are types of behavior that characterize the strong parties and the weak parties. So non-state actors in mediation around violent conflict, they tend to want more third parties involved, so they feel weak and they think that their position would be strengthened if, in the case of armed conflict mediation, if there can be more internationalization of it. But where a government happens to be weak and a non-state actor happens to be strong, actually they can behave in the opposite ways. So, for example, when I was a young man, I served in Bosnia during the war and during the siege of Sarajevo, and the recognized government was under siege and very weak, the Bosnian government, whereas the non-state actor, the Serbs, were on the attack, and so the negotiating positions, the behaviors were sort of reversed, and so it was the government that massively wanted to internationalize the mediation processes, the negotiation processes, and wanted to let the media in and wanted to mobilize international opinion and so on, whereas the Serbs were the non-state actor. They found themselves in the position that, say, authoritarian states often find themselves in, which is trying to say, we'll handle it bilaterally, keep out third parties, keep the media away, and so on. So in general, there are patterns of behavior that characterize state actors and non-state actors, but mostly it's really just a reflection of power relations, and when those power relations are different, the behaviors change too.
And do you remember a particular negotiating team that was quite that stood out in your career, stood out as being the most courteous or perhaps most professional?
So among mediators, I've known a lot of great mediators, and I think, for example, I was at the Cimetière des Rois, the cemetery here in Geneva the other day, and visited the grave of Sergio Vieira de Mello. He was a great, killed in Baghdad, really a great mediator. But Lakhdar Brahimi, Alvaro de Soto, I've sort of known a lot of the mediators of the last generation. In terms of the parties themselves, who it's been, a pleasure or a professional satisfaction to work with, I would say it's a slightly surreal space, the mediation space, because you're dealing with people who, on the one hand, may have committed very serious crimes and done terrible things, but in the end, they have the same range of personalities as everybody else, as you or I. So I remember sitting in Pale, the temporary capital of the Serbs in Bosnia above Sarajevo. And a lot of those people are war criminals. Several of them, Radovan Karadzic, for example, and Ratko Mladic are in jail for genocide. And yet, we would go there, the UN team, for negotiations. And there is a cognitive dissonance as you realize that, people have committed, like really awful crimes, can be funny or boring or good company or share an interest in books or whatever. And it is a little bit of an occupational hazard that you get, you can get sort of seduced by people a bit because of their interpersonal skills. And actually, I was very struck. If you read Holbrook's book, To End a War, on the Dayton negotiations that he led, that in the end produced the peace agreement in Bosnia, you know, there is Milosevic, president of Serbia, you know, who is a terrible person in many ways. But he's quite funny, and he sits there tickling the piano, and he sings, and he brings everybody along. And you know, the Serbs got a very good deal at Dayton, better than their, you know, military situation would probably have predicted. And I do sometimes wonder whether, you know, maybe Holbrook, like everybody else, was a little bit seduced by the, you know, the charming criminal, which, you know, it's an occupational hazard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see it a lot today in TV, and especially in the past 20 years, that there tends to be like the charming sociopath that is very popular on TV as a character. And I imagine, how tough is it to really like disassociate with somebody that is just a charming person, but is a murderer?
I you know, frankly, being a politician in general, but being a war leader is about, you know, in large part about manipulation and use of mass psychology and manipulative engagement with your public and with people you interact with. And, you know, but frankly, you know, a lot of that is true of mediation too, you know, that reading people's emotions and responding to it in a way that will get you what you want is a big part of negotiation. But, you know, frankly, you know, that plays the strength of some slightly psychopathic people. So it's, I would say, both the roles of the mediator and the roles of the conflict parties tend to attract quite emotionally manipulative people. And the most effective people in that space do have some, you know, I'm not a psychologist, but I would say some, you know, psychopathic tendencies. That is a capacity to stand back from their own emotions, yet to read the emotions of the others and to maneuver the other party as they want. I mean, there's a lot of mediation theory that is around, you know, interest-based mediation, you know, trying to construct the right value equation. But there is a huge emotional element to it, and the one who can manipulate the emotional context or read it and use it often does well.
And I mean, when two leaders meet, because oftentimes politicians are labeled as sociopaths, or, you know, being able to get to their position of where they are requires some degree of, you know, ruthlessness. And I wanted to touch upon the kind of informal aspect of negotiations, kind of the golf course kind of exchange. How much of that do you find is, you know, in play in mediating these conflicts?
A lot. I mean, there is a lot of an emotional element. An emotional intelligence counts for a lot, and the personal connection matters. And, you know, in IR theory and in negotiation theory, there's a lot of discussion of, you know, ripeness and mutually hurting stalemates and, you know, interest-based results, and all of that is true, Luke. But in the end, what tips people into a process, and then within a process, what tips people towards yes, are often like, what their heart or their gut is telling them. I often think like a really interesting example is the negotiations between de Klerk and Mandela on Robben Island. In sort of classic mediation theory, I'm not sure it was ripe, and I'm not sure there was really a mutually hurting stalemate, but there was a connection between de Klerk and Mandela that made, I think, de Klerk feel that this was a time to take some risks, that it was tough when, they were the white government in power. They knew that they had a long-term problem and they would have to give up their control of power. But the way they did it, the speed with which they did it, in the end was, I think, more about the emotional connection between de Klerk and Mandela than it was necessarily about the power balance. I mean, there were issues of power balance and particularly economic pressures on the apartheid regime, but the emotional context, I mean, what you call, the golf course interaction, in that case it was a prison interaction, it matters a lot.
And when you've participated in these talks, throughout your career, have you ever just encountered, maybe not necessarily the leader, or whoever's leading the delegation for the negotiations, and you just realize that the root of the conflict is just, a lot of it's just based on ego, rather than, the pursuit of resources or anything beyond that?
Well, I mean, yes. Ego is a big part of it, particularly in highly personalized systems. I think there's a lot of negotiation theory that talks about interests and how to balance the interests in the end. But one of the key factors is, in these processes, is usually power and the control on the levers of power of the principles. So and that is, very tied up with ego. A lot of negotiations, in fact, also have to do with sort of life cycle. A lot of insurgencies become negotiable as a charismatic leader becomes older and sort of starts reflecting on life and sort of wants out. So yeah, I mean, the personal, egotistical concerns are huge. They're a part that almost never goes away.
And I wanted to touch upon the insurgencies. Especially in the 20th century and into the 21st, we tend to see a lot more non-state actor versus state actor conflicts.
Yeah.
We don't have the direct conflict of the great powers as we once did. But I was wondering why they tend to last longer and tend to be more stretched out over the years rather than state-on-state conflict.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it, partly it has to do with, objective factors like, if there is a grievance, a community is oppressed or marginalized, then it's often very, easy for an armed group to sustain a conflict based on, the narrative of grievance that comes from that community. But, there is also, an extent to which all narratives are constructed, and then it's a matter of whether or not the resources are available to sustain a conflict until the end. And there's a particular phenomenon that what I call, I've never written about it, but I call the Pinocchio principle, which is a lot of insurgencies are like sort of puppet regimes, like Pinocchio, or puppet structures. So, like the white Rhodesian government basically animated the Renamo insurgency in Mozambique. And like more than 40 years after the White Rhodesian government has, gone to the ash heap of history, Renamo is still there. And similarly, in Bosnia that we were talking about, the Serbs and the Croats both created these little proxy groups, Bosnian Serb forces, which they armed from Serbia, and Croatia created these Bosnian Croat militias. And the reason I call them the Pinocchio phenomenon is because, in the story, Pinocchio, the little wooden puppet, always says he wants to be a real boy. And I think, that's what happens is you create these proxy armies to do your dirty work in a neighboring state, but then the little puppet you've created decides it wants to be a real boy, and they find ways to keep on fighting. And so I think the world now is full of these little Pinocchios that have figured out how to keep fighting. And there's also been, a shift in the business model of insurgency warfare that has exacerbated it. In the old days, there was a definite relationship between Geppetto, the guy who makes the puppet, and Pinocchio. In the Cold War, if the US or the Soviet Union or China wanted to, destabilize a country, they would directly support the insurgency, the Pinocchio. But after the end of the Cold War, a lot of insurgencies had to be able to sustain themselves, and it's always by some form of trafficking, or almost always. So, or extortion. So they tax the population among which they live, they extort, or they traffic people, weapons, drugs, or some combination of that. And so, unlike in the fairy story about the Pinocchio, these Pinocchios can find ways to sustain themselves, and there is a Darwinian process where they have huge incentives to become independently viable creatures, and then they come alive like Pinocchio, and that tends to feed very long. Once they find a business model where they can feed themselves as real boys, as real Pinocchios, those insurgencies can go on for a long time. Like when the FARC in Colombia got deeply into the drug trade, for example, it didn't matter if the external sponsors cut off their support, or even if the grievance got less. Once you have a business model, Pinocchio has come alive.
And I wanted to touch upon kind of the let's say the PRification of war since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps probably during the Cold War, where language around war has changed. Now we call them defense forces, or stabilizing a regime, or like Vladimir Putin called it, a special military operation. What do you think that language change says about us as a society today, where we don't really want to face the fact of conflict?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I haven't gone into the academic literature on it, but actually my sense is that you're right, that we have sanitized war in general a little bit. The language around it, you're right, has become sanitized. But even in this age of mass communication, war is somehow less shocking to the public imagination than it was, for example, in much of the 20th century. I think, when we were talking about, when I was, coming of age in the world of war and peace, war was a major public concern, that in the 1960s and 70s, popular culture was dominated by anxieties about war. You know, many of the great films, you know, Dr. Strangelove, or going back even further, On the Beach and so on, reflected really deep public anxieties about war. And then in the 80s in particular, I mean, there was a slew of movies, novels about, you know, from the US perspective about the conflict in Vietnam. I mean, I guess starting with Coming Home and The Deer Hunter and so on. And there is an extent to which, you know, after the end of the Cold War, warfare, particularly catastrophic warfare, nuclear warfare, you know, it didn't disappear as a public concern, but it receded. And actually, one of my major worries in the world today is, in fact, that we're not quite worried enough about war. You know, nuclear weapons are being modernized. We're getting more nuclear powers. We're developing, you know, other forms of weapons of mass destruction. The norms against interstate conflict are declining, are eroding, and yet we don't have that much public outcry about it. I think, you know, right now there is, you know, a sort of shock about what's going on in Gaza, but the wider issues presented by war in the world simply don't have their place in the public imagination the way they did a generation ago.
And do you think politicians are betting on the fact that now we have so much information funneled to us that we become numb to, you know, these types of events?
I don't know, but I certainly agree with people who say that the relative decline of reality, you know, the fact that you know, there's very little distinction between fact and a belief anymore. You know, if you believe something and you repeat it a lot of times and you have friends on the social media who say it, then for you it sort of becomes a fact. I think that phenomenon, you know, which has been very widely studied and commented on, that clearly adds to polarization and atomization of society. And those are phenomena that exacerbate the risk of warfare. Yeah, so I would say, broadly speaking, the technological context within which we live is making the risk of war greater.
And, you know, this is something that's always been kind of interesting to me, is how you know, obviously we touched upon this earlier with Xi Jinping's military parade, but the shift away from a Western-led order, and how let's say, the currency of legitimacy in not necessarily just, you know, negotiations, but, you know, in PR and, you know, goodwill. And do you think the West has eroded that, you know, legitimacy of, you know, goodwill, you know, seeing how they could be perceived as hypocritical on their stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, among others? And was that legitimacy solely based on the fact that they had all the power at that, or most of it at that point in time, and now we see a balance in the force?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the West had a lot of soft power. I mean, we're here in Geneva. I mean, these international organizations, you know, represent, you know, global ideas, or what are presented as global ideas and global norms of, you know, everything from, you know, human rights to a certain conception of humanitarian assistance and so on. And they all have global instruments behind them. But in a lot of the world, they are perceived as basically being Western-led or Western-inspired. The whole post-World War II international order is seen as basically a creature of, you know, the Western Europe and North America. And I think, the enormous pressure that, say that the humanitarian community here in Geneva is under now, funding pressure and so on, is that as the relative economic weight of, the European economies comes down, and the relative economic weight of other, the Gulf countries or East Asia or South Asia rises, there isn't the degree of support for those international norms and institutions, because they have been perceived, although formally global, they've been perceived as largely Western. So there is definitely a decline of sort of Western soft power that reflects, in part, as you were putting out, the hypocrisy on certain actual conflicts, but more, I think, it just reflects a relative decline of military and economic power. And I think, in a way, the world is reverting to the norm that since World War II, so for almost a century, for 80 years, the world power structure has either been bipolar in the Soviet Union, USA period, sort of 1950 to 1990, or it's been unipolar, which is the US. And bipolar, and in particular unipolar systems, are generally characterized by much, much lower levels of conflict. And what we've got now with the relative decline of US and Western power is not the replacement of the West by China or by Russia, but you've got these contesting poles of power, which is a much more normal state of affairs, and is a much more dangerous state of affairs, particularly now, because of course we have the technological capacity to wipe ourselves out.
So this new frontier that we're exploring is somewhat of is going to create a higher frequency of state-on-state conflict rather than non-state actors.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, between actually for most of the post-World War II period, I mean, there's been very little interstate conflict.
Mm-hmm.
It's by far the longest period in world history without major interstate conflict. And in fact, it's one of the great achievements of the much maligned United Nations order, is that the set of rules devised in San Francisco in 1945 were a great set of rules for keeping the world relatively stable. Whereas I think with the decline of that post-World War II order, we are seeing something more like the return to the law of the jungle, in which the contending creatures in that jungle are unrestrained by normative and legal frameworks. And so there are, in Russia, Ukraine, I mean, there are problems between China and the US that hopefully won't, but could erupt into warfare. And, all over the world, I mean, right now we have a risk of warfare between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and, and then Rwanda and Congo are in conflict. So I think, yes, we are seeing a rise of interstate warfare after a long period in which almost all warfare has been intrastate, internal. And I think that trend is going to get worse.
And I've noticed a lot of these conflicts. Sometimes there's no official, and the U.S. is one of the leading factors in this, but countries don't officially declare war on each other as much as they used to. I mean, just recently, yesterday, the Israelis just bombed Doha, but clearly there's condemnation from the Qatari side, but they must have known something was coming towards them. Otherwise, what's the use of all that military equipment? And is there kind of this sort of implicity or secrecy between powers where they make these kind of backroom deals where they're okay with bombing a particular area, these kind of backroom deals, and how do you think that affects kind of the trust in mediation circles?
Well, what I would say is, where I agree with you, is that the formal and formalistic aspects of war and peace are declining. You're right. No, hardly anybody declares war anymore. And people don't end wars with peace agreements anymore. And that is a major challenge for my profession, for mediation. It's not that they don't end wars, but they don't end them with big formal declarations and signed documents and so on. And they may never totally go away. So you're onto something important, that the sort of ritualistic or formalistic elements around war and peace are eroding, which, by the way, is also true of the way wars are fought. I mean, every generation has its savage wars, but you mentioned Gaza. Well, I actually have now forgotten the exact figure, but like about 80% of the people killed, I believe, are civilians.
Yeah.
And they are more or less directly targeted. I mean, they're not sort of incidental collateral damage. They're sort of right in the firing line. And I think there are places that may be even worse, Darfur and so on. So I think, and there was. I don't think it should be exaggerated, but there was, after the Geneva Conventions and so on, a certain understanding of what are the formal limits of warfare. And I think, you're right about declarations of war for sure. You're right about the way wars end. And I would say even the ways wars are fought, there is a sort of erosion of the formal apparatus.
And touching back on the Gaza topic, there's kind of a war of words between the two parties online. They say it's a genocide, the others say it's a defensive war. And I wanted to, get your view on how important rhetoric is, in shaping, not only narratives today, but in the future. And how does rhetoric, what journey does it go on from there?
I think we certainly live in an age of information, control and manipulation. And I think the dynamics of that in open societies are different from those in more autocratic structures. So I think there is a decline in the legitimacy of actually all institutions, but particularly government, I think, in open societies, essentially from polarized and manipulated interventions on the social media. But there are also, some quite strong elements of resilience. But in autocratic societies, actually, the last decade has shown that it's quite easy to control an information environment in which the public will broadly support, military or other hostile actions that, in a more open society simply wouldn't be the case. And, I think that is an exacerbating factor in warfare today.
And I wanted to touch back a bit on rhetoric, because, when I think of rhetoric, the king of rhetoric is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And, I just wanted to get your opinion on his attempt as his foray into the negotiating world. He said he could solve the Ukraine-Russian war in a day. And so far, it's how
Yeah.
It's been almost half a year,
More.
more than half a year, that he's been president. What do you think of his type of negotiation style? And maybe to add further question in that question is, do you think private actors such as businessmen, are they particularly adept at negotiating a diplomatic crisis?
Well, to start with Trump, I mean, Trump is a great communicator. He's a great shaper of the narrative. He's a great controller of the narrative. There's no doubt about it. In that sense, he's a hugely successful communicator. And he's also understood that, the slavish loyalty to facts, doesn't matter as much in the modern information space as it did 5 or 10 years ago. If you say it enough, it becomes sort of a reality in its own right. I don't think he's like unique in that, but I think he's a super example of it. Does it make him a better negotiator? I mean, he says that he has fixed, as he called it, 7 wars. As he pointed out, that's about 1 a month since he came to office. Actually, I think it's not true. When he came into office, there were in January, there were basically 2 big wars going on that the United States had major stakes in. That was the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. And those wars are worse than ever. The other wars, I mean, he says that it was because of him that India and Pakistan stopped fighting. Pakistan agrees with that. India doesn't agree with that. So I don't know. So I think what I would say is that Trump is an extraordinarily effective controller of the narrative, but whether controlling of the narrative actually makes getting rid of armed conflict in the world easier or not, I'm still to be convinced. As you say, it's been a long 24 hours on the Ukraine war.
Yeah. And I mean, he seems like someone who understands that we live in a very optic, PR-based society. And, clearly behind doors, he's not he's not solving the Ukrainian-Russian war in 24 hours. And have you heard anybody, in that space talk about his negotiation style, or?
I mean, perception is reality for sure, and or at least to some extent. I mean, he does have. There are some distinctive features of Trump's intervention in war. One is the immediate sort of bombastic engagement via the public and the pressure he puts on. The other, which of course appeared famously in his book, The Art of the Deal, is you put a lot on the table and then you take it off the table, and so the parties never know quite where they are. He said he was going to impose sanctions on Russia, a whole new wave, if Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire. Actually, Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire, and then everything is still fine. And some people, have said that, the taco thing, Trump always chickens out. But, actually I think there is something unsettling that can shake things loose. I think on the big ones, we haven't seen it yet, but, the fact is that particularly on Russia-Ukraine, the parties are getting a little nervous that they may have to talk more than they do. The other, aspect of the Trump deal making that I think is really important is these extremely explicit economic transactional diplomacy. So, he calls the Cambodians and Thais when they have a border dispute and say, if you want, a lower tariff rate with the United States, you're going to reach a peace agreement right now. And in Ukraine, he says if you want any support, you're going to hand over all these, to U.S. companies the rights to exploit all these minerals, and and then something similar is happening in Congo. So Trump, you're right, has optically changed a lot. There is a distinction between perception and reality that comes to bite him in the ass at some points. But there is actually a difference of approach, this putting anything on the table and then keeping the parties off balance, and this element of these very transactional economic arrangements that probably does open up space in some conflicts where there hasn't been any space before. So I wouldn't totally write Trump off just as a sort of bombastic clown, which is the way he's presented in some of the liberal media.
So you think we're seeing more of an approach to a transactional kind of business type negotiation? Is he setting a precedent, essentially?
Yeah. I mean, on the Ukraine thing, this minerals deal, that's sort of diplomacy a la Al Capone. I mean, that's basically extortion. If you want to be able to get by in this world, you're going to have to give me a lot of stuff. And that's a very crude form of diplomacy. And there's a version of it, actually a more interesting version of it going on in Congo. And there are people who say, actually, he's just making explicit what has often been implicit. So for example, all of the security treaties between the United States and the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on, are fundamentally, but more implicitly, based on the idea that there will be a U.S. security guarantee if there are certain privileged economic engagements by the U.S. and by U.S. entities. And so I think what's dramatic is that it's explicit and in your face, and at least in the case of the Ukraine one, essentially extortionist in its approach. But like with many of these developments, it's not totally new. It's just new in its scale and format.
And just one last concluding question. Where do you see the world in terms of conflicts and interstate rivalry in the next 10 years?
Yeah, getting worse. I think there are more wars going on now. I mean, the wars in detail are counted, as it were, by this Uppsala conflict database in Sweden. And they started counting wars, in great detail in the 1980s. And the level of warfare that they've identified, which is now about 60 wars involving at least one state party, that's a higher number than we've seen since they started counting. And the number of people killed in wars and the proportion of them who were civilians are generally rising. I mean, it's a zigzag, but it's rising. And I think the real risk is that war systems tend not to be linear. At the moment, there is a sort of more or less linear growth in warfare and its harms, but there is always the risk that it tips into catastrophic levels greater than that. And I think as the multilateral system comes under stress, the rules of the post-World War order come under stress, there is the risk that a linear growth in warfare over the next decade could tip into something catastrophic.
Okay. Thank you for the light note at the end of
Yeah.
this, but I really appreciate you coming on to the show, and thank you so much, David.
It's been a pleasure, Luke. Yeah, I hope to see you again.
Thank you.